Robert Caldwell had always been the quiet type, preferring the solitude of his modest apartment and the company of his law books to social gatherings. At 34, he had built a respectable career as a property law consultant, but remained largely unknown in the bustling legal circles of downtown. His colleagues often joked that he could disappear for weeks and no one would notice, a quality that would soon prove more valuable than anyone could have imagined. When the call came about his eccentric great-uncle Tobias's passing, Robert felt a twinge of regret. He had met the old man only a handful of times, mostly at awkward family gatherings where Tobias would corner him to rant about those vultures next door and boundary thieves in fancy suits. Robert had nodded politely, assuming these were the paranoid musings of an isolated old man. The lawyer handling Tobias's estate was surprised when Robert was named the sole heir to 120 acres of seemingly worthless land on the outskirts of Oak Ridge County. Not exactly a gold mine, the lawyer commented, sliding the deed across his desk. Mostly woodland with a small cabin, far from town and lacking modern amenities. Property taxes are paid up for the next year, but honestly, most people would just sell it to a developer and be done with it. Robert took the keys to the property with limited enthusiasm. The following Saturday, he drove his aging Subaru down increasingly narrow roads until pavement gave way to gravel and finally to dirt. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, smaller than he remembered from his childhood visit, its grey wood weathered by decades of seasons, yet somehow defiantly intact. Pushing open the creaking door, Robert was struck not by the musty smell he expected, but by the surprising orderliness within. The cabin's single room was dominated by a large oak desk and filing cabinets, with a narrow cot pushed against one wall. This hadn't been merely a retreat, it had been a headquarters. As daylight faded, Robert discovered his great-uncle's meticulous records, not the ramblings of a paranoid hermit, but the careful documentation of a man with purpose. Tobias had catalogued boundary disputes, easement violations, and the gradual encroachment of the neighbouring Pinecrest estates, an upscale development with a notoriously aggressive homeowners association. Newspaper clippings chronicled the transformation of Oak Ridge County from rural farmland to an increasingly upscale suburb. Property listings showed home prices in Pinecrest estates climbing from $300,000 to over $1.2 million in just 15 years. Photos showed heavy equipment inching closer to Tobias's property line with each new phase of development. Most intriguing were the survey markers. Tobias had documented their original positions with photographs and GPS coordinates, then created a second set of photos showing how they had been moved, sometimes by just a few feet, sometimes by yards. Each displacement was dated and notarized. As midnight approached, Robert sat at his great-uncle's desk, the cabin illuminated by a single lamp, reviewing decades of notes, survey maps, and correspondence. A letter caught his attention, a response from the county assessor's office to Tobias dated 3 years earlier. While we appreciate your concerns, Mr. Caldwell, without a formal survey conducted by a licensed professional, we cannot proceed with adjusting the official property lines. Robert's eyes widened as he spread out the county's official boundary map and compared it with his great-uncle's meticulous documentation. With his background in property law, he recognized something that his great-uncle had suspected, but never confirmed. The boundary lines between his inherited land and Pinecrest estates had been incorrectly drawn in the county records, not by feet, but by acres. As dawn broke over the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, a plan began to form in Robert's mind. He carefully returned the documents to their folders, a slight smile forming on his lips. His great-uncle hadn't been crazy after all. and what most would see as worthless woodland was about to become the most valuable leverage Robert could imagine. Robert quit his consulting job the following Monday, citing a need for personal time to manage a family estate. His boss, surprised by the sudden departure of his most reliable employee, offered him a leave of absence instead. "I appreciate it, but this might take longer than you'd expect," Robert replied with an enigmatic smile. Over the next 6 months, Robert became a ghost on his own property. He moved a few essential belongings into the cabin, upgrading only the absolute necessities: a better mattress, basic plumbing, and a solar panel system that powered his laptop and camera equipment without requiring permits or utility connections. He grew a beard, adopted warm flannel shirts and work boots, and became indistinguishable from the local handymen and contractors who frequented the area. 3 weeks into his vigil, he observed the first surveying crew from Pinecrest Estates marking boundaries for what their promotional materials called the Preserve at Pinecrest. A cruel irony, given that the development would destroy one of the last undisturbed woodland areas in the county. Victoria Harrington, the HOA president, occasionally visited the site in her Range Rover, designer sunglasses perched on her perfectly highlighted hair as she gestured emphatically to subordinates. From his hidden vantage points among the trees, Robert photographed surveyors who never ventured far enough to check the actual boundary markers his great-uncle had meticulously maintained. He used a telephoto lens to document their instruments, their measurements, and most importantly, the coordinates they recorded in their field books. He noted how they referenced survey markers that had been moved years earlier, markers his great-uncle had photographed in their original positions. When construction began in early spring, Robert created a detailed blog. Each morning at dawn, he would circle his property on foot, noting new incursions and taking geotagged photographs. He recorded construction vehicles crossing onto his property, removing trees and leveling ground. He collected samples of water runoff from disturbed soil that flowed into the protected creek running through the center of his land. A potential environmental violation he carefully documented. Most importantly, he saved every newsletter, social media post, and promotional material from Pinecrest Estates announcing their exciting new phase of luxury homes. Experience nature without sacrificing luxury. One brochure proclaimed, featuring renderings of massive homes with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking what was unmistakably his property. At the local diner where he occasionally ate breakfast, Robert overheard conversations about the development. "Heard they're selling those places for $2 million minimum," one contractor said. "Victoria's a genius, convinced the board to leverage everything they had to fund this expansion. If it works, they'll double the size of Pinecrest and triple their prestige. If it fails," the man whistled low, "there won't be a Pinecrest HOA anymore." What Victoria and the HOA board didn't know was that Robert had quietly hired Premier Survey Group, the most respected firm in the state, to conduct an official survey. He then filed to update the county records with the correct boundaries, a process that would take months to complete, but would eventually confirm what Robert already knew: they were building on his land. While he waited, Robert made one more crucial move. He contacted an environmental law specialist and a civil rights attorney known for fighting against predatory HOAs. Without revealing his full strategy, he retained both on contingency, providing just enough information to secure their interest. "I may have a case that would define your career," he told each of them. "Be ready in about 4 months." As summer approached and foundations were poured for the first dozen homes, Robert remained patient. The chess pieces were in position. Now he just needed to let his opponents make the moves that would lead to their own checkmate. As winter gave way to spring, Construction accelerated at a feverish pace. The sound of heavy machinery echoed through the once quiet forest from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week. Robert watched as massive excavators tore into the earth, uprooting centuries-old oak trees in minutes. Foundation after foundation was poured, framing went up, and roads were cut through what had once been pristine woodland, all following the incorrect boundary lines. "They're building like there's no tomorrow," remarked Professor Eleanor Winters, Robert's former law school mentor who specialized in property disputes. They sat in her book-lined university office, reviewing his latest documentation. This kind of aggressive timeline usually suggests financial pressure. "They've pre-sold almost everything," Robert replied, showing her marketing materials boasting that phase 1 was 90% sold out. The question is, what happens to those sales when the buyers discover they don't actually own the land under their luxury homes? Eleanor leaned back in her chair, tapping a pencil against her desk. "In my 40 years of property law, I've seen boundary disputes over feet, even yards, but never an entire subdivision. What you're documenting here is unprecedented. The market was exceptionally hot, and Pinecrest was selling homes before they were even built. Wealthy buyers, doctors from the new medical center, tech executives relocating from the coast, and financial professionals seeking tax advantages put down substantial deposits, eager to join what was considered the most prestigious community in the county. The HOA's coffers swelled with these deposits and new member fees. Local news outlets ran glowing profiles of Victoria Harrington, praising her bold vision for Pinecrest Estates. "We're not just building homes," she told the Oak Ridge Times, standing proudly at the construction site in an immaculate white pantsuit and hard hat that appeared never to have seen actual use. "We're creating a legacy, a sanctuary for those who demand the very best." The accompanying photo showed her gesturing toward what was unmistakably the creek on Robert's property. Robert maintained meticulous records of every statement, every promotional claim, and every published plan. He created a detailed timeline correlating the construction progress with the weather, noting how after heavy rains, construction crews would pump muddy runoff directly into the protected creek, a clear environmental violation. He documented the destruction of several historic survey markers his great-uncle had photographed, collecting physical evidence in carefully labeled containers. By midsummer, 96 homes in various stages of completion stood on what Robert now had documentation to prove was his land. Some were merely foundations, others fully framed awaiting finishing work, while a dozen showcased homes stood complete, furnished, and ready for the grand opening weekend. The county records had finally been updated with the official survey results, but Robert had strategically kept this information quiet, ensuring the records were filed without fanfare. He paid the additional fees to expedite the process without drawing attention, and the update appeared in the system with no notifications sent to adjacent property owners, a procedural oversight he had anticipated and counted on. Robert continued to maintain his low profile around the property. When construction crews occasionally spotted him, they simply nodded in his direction, assuming he was just another local contractor or perhaps a hiker passing through the area. Once, a site supervisor approached him. "You live around here?" The man asked, squinting against the sun. "Just keeping an eye on things," Robert replied ambiguously. The supervisor nodded. "Place is changing fast. Progress, they call it." He gestured toward the half-built mansions. "Though between you and me, they're building these things so fast I wonder if they'll still be standing in 10 years. Robert smiled slightly. "I doubt they'll last nearly that long," he said, a comment the supervisor took as casual criticism of construction quality, rather than the prophecy it actually was. The grand opening of the preserve at Pinnacrist was scheduled for the second weekend of September. Glossy invitations had been sent to prospective buyers, local dignitaries, and media outlets. A string quartet was booked, catering arranged, and temporary landscaping installed to disguise the raw construction sites surrounding the dozen completed showcase homes. Several families had already scheduled moving dates for the following month. 3 days before the event, as the first promotional banners were being hung, Robert finally made his move. He had his documents professionally bound into 3 thick volumes. Property records and survey documentation in the first, photographic evidence of encroachment in the second, and environmental impact evidence in the third. He sent certified letters to each HOA board member, the Pinnacrist Estates Management Company, the construction company, and the 3 banks financing the project. Each letter contained the same carefully worded message, drafted with the help of his attorneys. According to updated county records, see enclosed documentation, you have constructed approximately 96 residential structures on my property without permission, easements, or compensation. I am open to discussing an equitable resolution to this matter within the next 14 business days. Robert also included a USB drive containing digital copies of all his documentation, along with a private link to a cloud server where higher resolution files could be accessed. The level of detail and professionalism in his presentation was designed to convey one clear message. This was not a frivolous claim. The certified letter reached Victoria Harrington at 9:42 a.m. on a Wednesday. By 10:30 a.m., an emergency board meeting had been called. By noon, 3 different law firms had been contacted. By 3:00 p.m., the story had somehow leaked to local real estate blogs, and by dinner time, the first worried calls from home buyers were flooding the Pinnacrist sales office. "This is clearly a shakedown," Victoria declared to the hastily assembled board members in the Pinnacrist clubhouse. "Some backwoods hare trying to cash in on our success." Though she projected confidence, her manicured fingernails tapped an anxious rhythm on the marble conference table. "Our surveys were conducted by professionals. Our boundaries are correct. This will be dealt with swiftly." The board voted unanimously to proceed with the grand opening as planned, while their legal team reviewed Robert's claims. Victoria assured everyone that Robert's claims would be easily disproven, and that even acknowledging the issue publicly would only lend it credibility. However, when the HOA's lawyers investigated, they discovered the updated county records and the meticulously documented history of the boundary markers. What began as a routine review quickly evolved into a crisis meeting that stretched late into the night. "The problem isn't just the updated survey," explained Bennett Wilson, the HOA's visibly uncomfortable lead attorney, as he spread documents across the conference table the following evening. "It's that we can find evidence that concerns about these boundaries were raised several times over the past decade." He slid forward emails from previous board meetings where members had discussed potential boundary discrepancies, but had voted to proceed with minimal surveying to control costs. In one particularly damning email, a former board treasurer had written, "Full property line verification would add $75,000 to the budget. The adjacent land is undeveloped forest owned by some recluse. Odds of issues arising are minimal compared to certain cost savings." "So we made a mistake," Victoria said dismissively. "We offer him fair market value for the land and move on." Bennett removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Mrs. Harrington, with all due respect, this isn't a simple boundary dispute. The documented history of being warned about potential issues and choosing to ignore them constitutes willful trespass." Courts tend to view that harshly. In the sudden silence that followed, another attorney spoke up. There's more. The environmental violations alone, building in protected wetland areas, diverting the creek, illegal discharge of construction runoff, carry potential fines of $10,000 per day per violation. Victoria's face paled as she finally grasped the magnitude of their situation. What are you saying? I'm saying, Bennett replied grimly, that our legal defense is nearly impossible. And the longer we wait to approach Mr. Caldwell with a reasonable settlement offer, the stronger his position becomes. The morning after the emergency legal briefing, Victoria decided to take matters into her own hands. Despite her attorney's explicit advice to wait for a formal negotiation process, she assembled a small delegation, herself, the HOA Vice President Charles Winthrop, the Secretary Diane Mayer, and a junior attorney who hadn't been quick enough to decline the invitation. This is about presence and pressure, Victoria explained as her Range Rover navigated the increasingly narrow roads toward Robert's cabin. I've closed deals with Fortune 500 executives. I can handle some opportunistic Herbert. When they arrived at the clearing where the cabin stood, Victoria was surprised by what she saw. Rather than the dilapidated shack she'd imagined, the cabin appeared sturdy and well-maintained. Solar panels gleamed on the southern-facing roof, and the grounds were orderly, with split firewood neatly stacked and a small vegetable garden thriving near the creek. Robert sat on the front porch in a rocking chair, seemingly expecting them. He wore clean jeans and a button-up shirt, not the backwoods recluse Victoria had described to the board, but not the sharp-suited lawyer she might have anticipated either. He watched calmly as they approached, neither standing to greet them nor appearing intimidated by their presence. "Mr. Caldwell," Victoria began, her voice carrying the practiced warmth she used for potential donors at charity galas. "We thought it might be helpful to discuss your concerns in person. I'm sure we can reach an accommodation that's beneficial for everyone." Robert gestured to several empty chairs on the porch. "Please sit. I've been expecting you." His quiet confidence unsettled Victoria more than any hostility might have. For the next 20 minutes, Victoria outlined what she called a generous proposal, $500,000 for the disputed property, nearly double its undeveloped market value, with the condition that Robert sign a non-disclosure agreement about the entire affair. When she finished, Robert remained silent for a long moment, simply watching a hawk circling overhead. "That's an interesting starting point," he finally said, "but it doesn't address the actual situation." He stood and led them inside the cabin, where 3 large maps were displayed on the wall. The first showed the property boundaries as they appeared in county records 10 years ago. The second showed the current, updated boundaries. The third showed the Pennycrest development superimposed over his property, with 96 red dots indicating homes built on his land. "Let me be clear about our actual position," Robert said, his calm demeanor unchanged. "You have 3 options." He outlined the first option. The HOA could purchase the land for 5 times its market value, approximately $25 million, plus compensation for environmental damages. The second option, he explained while pulling out detailed construction photos, would be to remove all 96 homes and restore the land to its original condition. An impossibility given the investment already made and the families preparing to move in. And the third option? Charles Winthrop asked anxiously, his earlier confidence evaporated. Robert opened his laptop and turned it to face them. On screen was a comprehensive proposal document titled Caldwell Commons, a model for sustainable community development. This is where Robert revealed his true scheme, The HOA could agree to a 99-year lease of the property, with strict environmental protections for the remaining undeveloped acres, significantly reduced HOA fees for all residents, and the establishment of a community land trust that would ensure affordable housing options in future developments. You've built luxury homes that only the wealthiest can afford, destroying protected woodland to do it. Robert explained, his voice finally showing emotion. My proposal allows those homes to remain, but transforms how your community operates and grows. Victoria's face flushed with anger. This is extortion. You engineered this entire situation. Robert simply walked to his great-uncle's old desk and removed a leather-bound journal. My great-uncle, Tobias, documented your HOA's gradual encroachment for over 15 years, he said, handing Victoria the journal opened to a page dated a decade earlier. He thought your kind of development is entire life, the kind that takes public resources and natural beauty and locks them behind gates for the privileged few. He looked each of them in the eye. I didn't engineer anything. I simply finished what he started. Victoria began to protest, but Charles placed a restraining hand on her arm. The junior attorney was already scanning Robert's proposal with growing interest. We'll need time to review this with the full board, Charles said, his businessman's instincts recognizing that Robert's third option, despite its demands, might be their only viable path forward. Robert nodded. You have 48 hours. After that, I meet with the county commissioners, the EPA, and the families who've put deposits on homes they'll never be able to occupy. As the delegation departed, only the junior attorney glanced back, noting how Robert had returned to his rocking chair, gazing out over the land his great-uncle had protected for so long, and which would now serve a purpose neither the HOA nor the developers had ever imagined. 1 year later, Robert walked along a newly established nature trail that wound through what was now officially called Caldwell Commons. The autumn air was crisp, and golden leaves drifted down from the old oaks that had been spared from development. Children's laughter echoed from the community playground visible through the trees. The transformation had not been easy. After 2 extensions to Robert's deadline, the HOA board had finally voted 7-2 to accept his proposal, with Victoria and one loyal ally dissenting. The subsequent months had been filled with legal negotiations, community meetings fraught with tension, and the delicate process of transitioning from an exclusive enclave to something entirely different. Victoria had resigned in disgrace when it became public that the board had ignored earlier warnings about the boundary issues. The local newspaper's investigation had uncovered her emails pushing for faster construction despite environmental concerns, and her reputation had crumbled as quickly as her carefully cultivated public image. She had sold her Pinecrest home at a significant loss and moved to another state. Mr. Caldwell, called a voice, interrupting Robert's thoughts. Melissa Chen, a young mother pushing a stroller, waved to him from the trail junction. The Community Garden Committee is meeting tonight. We were hoping you'd join us. Her family had been among the first to move into one of the completed homes, just as the controversy was erupting. I'll try to make it, Robert promised with a smile. He still found it strange to be treated as a community leader rather than an adversary, but the transition had been smoother than he'd anticipated. Under the new agreement, the 96 homes remained, but the HOA's powers had been significantly reduced. The oppressive rules that had made Pinecrest infamous, from the specific shade of acceptable house paint to the height of grass, had been replaced with common-sense guidelines focused on sustainability and community well-being. The remaining undeveloped acres, nearly 60% of Robert's inherited land, had been placed in a land trust, with public trails and conservation areas that benefited everyone in the county. A portion of the former HOA fees now funded scholarships for local students and support for area homeless shelters. Most significantly, the agreement required that 20% of all future development within Caldwell Commons be dedicated to affordable housing, a provision that had initially horrified the existing homeowners, but which had gradually gained acceptance as teachers, firefighters, and healthcare workers became neighbours rather than abstractions. Robert had moved into his great-uncle's cabin, renovating it with sustainable materials while preserving its rustic character. He'd added a small office where he now worked as a consultant for other communities, seeking to challenge predatory development and establish more equitable housing models. The journal entries he'd been adding to his great-uncle's leather-bound book had evolved into a manuscript that a university press had recently agreed to publish. As Robert reached the edge of the forest, he could see the homes of Caldwell Commons stretching before him, still beautiful and well-maintained, but now part of a more diverse landscape that included community gardens, public art installations, and gathering spaces open to all county residents. James Turner, one of the original board members who had voted for Robert's proposal, was checking the rain barrels at the community garden. He nodded to Robert. "The creek restoration project passed the environmental assessment," he said. "Work can begin next month." Tobias would have been pleased. Robert replied, thinking of his great-uncle's decades-long battle to protect the watershed. James smiled. "You know, I fought your proposal every step of the way at first. Thought you were destroying everything we'd built here." He gestured to a group of children from different backgrounds playing together on the community green. "Never occurred to me we might be building something better." As evening approached and Robert stood on his porch, watching the sunset paint the community in warm hues, he reflected on how his great-uncle would have approved of the outcome. The legal battle had never been about money or revenge. It had been about correcting a long-standing injustice and creating something better from it. Sometimes, he thought, as lights began to appear in the windows of homes that were now part of a true community rather than an exclusive enclave, the best revenge wasn't about winning at all. It was about changing the game entirely.